Hello all and welcome to the session on machine learning techniques, chiefly classification and clustering categories. So in this session we'll talk about the classification and clustering methods. We'll talk about what is classification, we'll see what is clustering actually, and then we'll finally discuss about the key differences between classification and clustering methods. Also we will see a visual representation of comparison between two methods. We'll also discuss briefly what are various use cases for classification and various use cases for clustering methods. So to start with, uh, we normally nowadays see that there is a lot of data that is generated, whether it is from social media applications or whether from the production units. So there's a lot of data which is generated on daily basis, and this huge amount of data has to be organized and categorized into some categories. So organization and categorization of this data is what we are dealing with here, and this organization requires some methods and techniques to do that. So the two main techniques that is required here are classification and clustering methods. So these are basic categories of methods we are talking. So classification is a supervised technique method. In this method, there is this class label which is attached with the data already. That means there are predefined or predetermined set of classes into which the data has to be divided or categorized into. So any incoming data is checked for the class label it is associated with, and then based on the class labels, it is categorized into one of these classes. This technique requires an initial form of training using the historical data we already have, and so that we are able to create a model that can be utilized to classify any incoming unknown data in future. So any data that comes in to the system can be classified into one of the categories, or I would say one of the predetermined categories we already have during the training period. The main algorithms that we use in this methods are logistic regression, naive-based classifier, and support vector machines, specifically for anomaly detection. The other algorithms that we can use here is k-nearest neighbor, and one of the very common and natural form of algorithm is decision tree classification as well. Coming to the other category, that is the clustering method. So clustering is an unsupervised technique. On contrast, as compared to classification method, this is an unsupervised case where there are no class labels attached with the data. So how do we categorize or classify the data into various groups? So that is done based on the properties and characteristics any data element has. So any data element is observed for these properties or characteristics, and based on these properties, a similarity is obtained between the elements. All similar elements become part of the one natural group or a cluster. And any element that has a dissimilarity, it is different, then it belongs to the other natural group or clusters. So here we, instead of having predetermined class categories, we have predetermined number of groups that we have to create out of the input data supplied. Any objects which are clustered and grouped together have very much, I mean, say they are very much similar in their properties, and any data which is not into a same cluster belongs to another cluster has dissimilarity with the elements of the other cluster. The common algorithms that we use here are k-means clustering. There are fuzzy c-means clustering methods. Also, there are other Gaussian clustering methods as well. Coming to the comparison between both these techniques of classification and clustering. So classification, as I said, is a supervised case having already the class labels associated with it, while clustering is an unsupervised mechanism. So in the unsupervised mechanism, there are no class labels attached, and only the similarity between the properties is the criteria for a natural grouping or clustering of the elements. Uh, as classification has these class labels associated already, so in this case the data elements are required to be utilized for training the models. There are various model algorithms for classification techniques, and a training phase is one of the main and chief phase which is required. So it takes some time also, and there is a little complexity involved with case of classification as compared to clustering algorithms. Just to have a visual representation, so if we have number of animals here, so in this graphics you can see clearly that classification is done based on the class label. So all those belongs to a same class are grouped together into one class category, and in case of clustering, there is a similarity being identified between various animals. So it could be based on the shape and size, it could be based on the type or category. So when we talk about classification specifically, it is of again of two types. So classification is either a binary classification or a multi-class classification. So when we have two class categories to divide data into, it is called as binary classification. And when we have more than two classes, it is called as multi-class classification problem. In case of clustering, the natural grouping is formed between the elements which have the common property among them. Talking about various use cases of classification. So one of the very common classification use case is fraud detection, where the financial transactions now are being monitored regularly by the classification algorithms, and they are able to detect whether any transaction that is being done is a legitimate transaction or a fraud transaction. Then another common use cases is about diagnosing disease in the healthcare sector. So, disease detecting patient for having diabetes disease or not, having cancer disease or not, or having even the COVID disease or not. So, the MRI scans or the X-ray scans are supplied to the classification algorithms, and chiefly nowadays we are using neural networks and deep neural networks to diagnose such disease. Another very simple way of classification technique is to identify various characters. So, numbers, alphabets, any characters are identified, and based on the class, various classes that are already predetermined for numbers and characters, any input is then categorized into one of these, and character recognition, and then which leads to natural language processing is done. Then we have classifying objects into various categories. So any objects which are detected from the images or video sequences can be classified into predetermined categories. Coming to the clustering case, we have the common use cases as classifying the documents into the clusters or natural grouping based on the content, based on the size, based on the type of file. There is also a common use case called as customer segmentation used by the e-commerce websites very commonly to segment and generate a natural grouping of those customers having the common characteristics based on the purchase behavior, based on the demographic details, based on the activities they perform over the applications. And then there is a very common use case identifying the localities. This is again used by various organizations, various businesses to find those localities for sales and marketing their products. So the chief takeaways from this session is what is the technique related to classification, what are the techniques related to clustering, how classification is used in various use cases, what are the algorithms associated, how clustering is used for various use cases, and what are the methods and algorithms associated with it, and the key difference between classification and clustering techniques. That's all for the session. Thank you so much.